Wherever you look on the surface of the Earth, or indeed below the Earth, or way up in the atmosphere, you're going to find bacteria and viruses. Bacteria and viruses are absolutely everywhere. Look at any surface with enough magnification and you will see bacteria on it. The whole surface of the Earth is just covered with them. And yet, just a very short distance under the layer of the skin, under the surface of the skin, in the dermis, it's sterile. There are no bacteria in the inside of the body. Well, that's not entirely true if you count the gut as the inside of the body, because obviously the gut contains lots of bacteria. But between the gut and the skin, all the tissues of the body are completely sterile. Now, if they're not sterile, if there are bacteria or viruses growing in a tissue, we would call this infection. So infection is the presence of microorganisms in a tissue, and that can cause localized infection and it can cause systemic infection, clearly an abnormal situation. So there's bacteria absolutely everywhere, but how come people aren't sick most of the time? Well, this is because the body possesses immunity. And immunity is the ability to resist infections and the ability to get rid of infections should they occur. But just before we go on and look at immunity and infections, let's just think a little bit about the problem of infectious disease. Now, you've all had infections, you've all had viral and bacterial infections, and they make you sick for a period of time. And hopefully, well, obviously, because you listen to this podcast, you've recovered from them. But throughout human history, I think it's fair to say that the most common cause of death has been infectious disease. And if you look back at the history of the United Kingdom, for example, you see periods of time where the death rate was very high and others where the death rate was very low. And the reason for this is outbreaks of infectious disease. It was death that separated children from parents and separated loved ones, often at a very young age, because of infectious disease. And there's a lot of examples of this. I put a few in my White Physiology book, actually. If you look on page 346, there's a few. I've mentioned here that the Bible describes the plague of Ashdod, currently where the modern-day Gaza Strip is, about 1100 BC. Probably many thousands of people were killed. You know, ancient documented plagues and outbreak of infectious disease. The Black Death was quite famous in the United Kingdom. In England, in the 14th century, in the 1300s, it killed an estimated 100,000 people, and of course there weren't that many people around in those days. Bubonic Plague, the famous Great Plagues of 1665 in England, killed 68,000 people in London alone. Cholera epidemics in the 1850s in London killed thousands of people due to waterborne disease. And then when there's been migrations of people to other parts of the world, endogenous people often lack immunity. And when they come across new diseases, there's no immunity, and the death rates could be very high. So, for example, the endogenous population of Mexico, it's estimated, fell from 30 million to 1.6 million due to disease introduced by the European invaders, and the people had no immunity to that. Another really famous outbreak was the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-1919 at the end of the First World War. Now, this was a form of pandemic influenza, and really no one's too sure how many people it killed. Probably in excess of 20 million people, probably in excess of 40 million people. And indeed you do see estimates up to 60 million people killed by in that single influenza epidemic. And actually, if you look around graveyards now in England, you'll see that in 1919 a lot of young people died because this condition affected young people actually more than it affected older people. Smallpox was estimated to kill 300 million people in the 20th century. Just incredible. And in many poor areas of the world, most deaths are still caused by infectious disease, and children are particularly prone to this. Children under the age of 5. The most common cause of death in young children is still diarrhea and vomiting, simple viral and bacterial gastroenteritis. And malaria, of course, is still a complete scourge on humanity. 3,000 children died of malaria in Africa yesterday. 3,000 children died today of malaria in Africa. And the great tragedy is that 3,000 children will die tomorrow from malaria in Africa. It just goes on. And there's about 35 million people living with the HIV virus at the moment in the world from the HIV pandemic. And we could go on. Infectious disease has been a major problem, is a major problem in many poorer parts of the world, and is becoming an increasing problem. Maybe just mention one more very problematic disease, MDR-TB, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. Tuberculosis has always been a problem, is a problem now, and with the drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis, the situation's getting worse. So infectious disease, always been a problem. Now, it's interesting how you define infectious disease. And there was a guy called Robert Koch defined infectious disease way back in the 1890s. And what he said was that he formulated 4 postulates, actually, to determine whether a disease was infectious or not. And he said that the specific causative agent must be found in every case of the disease. So if someone's suffering from an infectious disease, and you look in that person, you should find the agent, that is usually the bacteria or the virus, which is causing that disease. And then he said the disease-causing organism must be capable of being isolated in pure culture. So if you take a bacteria out of an infected wound, or out of an infected bronchial passage, or out of an infected colon, whatever it is, and you culture that by putting a small number of the bacteria on a nutrient agar plate, or some sort of nutrient plate that the bacteria like to eat, then you should be able to culture them. You should be able to grow up the same organism by the billion on a culture plate. And then, if you inoculate a sample of the culture into a healthy subject, that should reproduce the disease. So you have a subject who's healthy, you put this bacteria that you've cultured back into them, back into a healthy subject, and that should cause the disease, indicating that it is the infectious bacteria which are causing the disease. And then the final postulate that Robert Koch put forward was that the disease organism must be recovered from the inoculated subject again, proving again that it was the bacteria which was causing the pathology. And Koch experimented on himself to demonstrate some of these postulates. And then later on in the late 1980s, probably early 1990s, around about 1990, there was an Australian doctor called Barry Marshall. And he said, look, I think that stomach ulcers, well, peptic ulcers anyway, duodenal and gastric ulcers, are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. I believe they are an infectious condition. And this was fairly revolutionary stuff at the time. And you know, he was pooh-poohed. He was put down by the establishment. Don't be ridiculous. Peptic ulcerations caused by stress, or whatever theories were floating around at the time. How could it be caused by infection? But what Barry Marshall did was he went into the stomachs using endoscopes of people with peptic ulcer, took out some of the bacteria